Hello, and welcome to the History of Ceramics. I'm Paul Greenhalgh.
And I'm Stephanie Rozene. So we're going to be diving right into the Ming Dynasty today, Paul. Blue and white china, porcelain, 1368 to 1644. This is an era of iconic vessels. But we want to kind of tell the story about how these specific pieces became this worldwide obsession. You can walk into any shop today and find blue and white porcelain.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that idiom, blue and white, became a global obsession.
It's ubiquitous, as you would say.
It's absolutely everywhere. It's totally ubiquitous and always interesting why such things happen. This is the beginnings. It's a fascinating tale about an absolutely key moment in Chinese history, the Ming Dynasty.
Yeah, and we're going to follow the rise of a penniless peasant who becomes the emperor. We're going to look at maritime voyages and expansion and imperial wealth, and then the Ming Dynasty has a kind of a sudden inward shift. So we're going to. I think it's important that we start by kind of tracing the Ming, how the Ming emperors have this direct connection to a town that you and I are very familiar with, Jingdezhen in China. It's the porcelain capital of the world. Even today, we have colleagues all over the world who go to Jingdezhen to have work made. It's not until the Song Dynasty around 1004 that it becomes it gains its modern name. And it's a tribute to porcelain at the Imperial court. But it's really in the Ming period that it becomes the official imperial factory. Yeah. And that is, this kind of galvanizing moment where the porcelain of Jingdezhen, when we think about Chinese porcelain, it comes from this place. It is, the two names are kind of synonymous with each other. Yeah. And we're going to be talking about the origins of that today.
Yeah. So, this is the story of the Ming Dynasty and the global obsession with blue and white.
So, I think to understand these ceramics, Paul, we've got to look at who was in charge. Yeah. Let's set the scene here and take a look at how the Ming Dynasty began.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, as we talk about it, one wondered endlessly whether the stories that are told about the beginning of the Ming are a myth or a legend. But weirdly enough, the story seems to be true.
And it's kind of fantastical.
It's a fantastical story. But to give a bit of context first, the previous dynasty, and we've described the dynasties, really successive periods in which there's a power base largely dominated by one family, the Han, the Tang, the Song, quite akin to European royal families, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanovers, broadly similar, with its own differences. But the Yuan dynasty was different. Between 1271 and 1368, so not an enormous amount of time, but about a century, the Mongols ruled China.
And it was a ruthless rule.
The Mongols not famous for their gentility and their provision of welfare
not
state.
Not terribly cuddly characters.
No, not famous for that. Yeah. And they essentially learned from previous Chinese dynasties how to fight wars and how to take control. They swept over China and took a grip. And it was a period in which there was a great deal of brutality, to say the least. Now, there was also art. Life carried on, but nevertheless thought to be a desperate period in Chinese history.
And the end of this period, we see sort of a land ravaged by famine, by poverty, by plague, perhaps. Right. Which creates, I think, it's the soup in which we see the rise of a new dynasty.
That's how it happened. So essentially, more or less ongoing civil war of endless coups breaking out here and there, and a number of peasant revolts, which is important. That is, uprisings from the base upwards, because they were starving. Yeah. And they also disliked the idea of a foreign ruler in their perception. And this led to the rise of the Ming and the extraordinary legend that the first Ming emperor, who overthrew the Mongols and took control of China again, was himself a peasant who came up through the ranks. And as I said, one always thinks that these things must be a mythology, but in fact, it's not. It's true.
He becomes emperor. He, of course, changes his name, as they seemingly all do, and we know him today as Emperor Hongwu, originally born Zhu Yuanzhang. And he's born into this destitute tenant farmer family in 1328. His parents were so impoverished that they were forced to give him away. Is that really true?
Well,
I mean, that's such a sad story. God.
Let's just assume it's all true. Because,
and presumably, well, maybe to a better situation, but perhaps not, as the accounting goes. He spends years wandering as a beggar and a penniless Buddhist monk. He had to beg for land just to bury his parents. So these are stark origins.
Let's say, and it parallels something we'll come to in future episodes of the Russian Revolution and the rise, because the leaders who changed the shape of the world, nearly all of them came from poor, desperate backgrounds.
And we think perhaps that this gave him a deep sensitivity to rural suffering,
right.
But also probably an intense lifelong distrust of corruption, elite corruption.
Right. It would fill you with hatred of the oppressors. It would also fill you with a sense that you had to change the world. Because of how you yourself had suffered and how others had suffered. So all of that, I think, is going on here.
What do we know about how he manages to seize control? If he has no money and he's a wandering monk, you need to have money to hire an army, one would think, or how has this come about?
What we're assuming is that he becomes intertwined with the various revolts which grow in scale and impetus and effectively become China-wide. And when that happens, and it has happened a number of times in the past, the Roman Empire occasionally, of course, several of the Roman emperors came through the ranks. And our broad assumption is that that's what's happened, that he proves himself to be a military leader of great skill. He clearly is a political leader of great skill and with a fanatical commitment. So that's not unique in history.
Right.
So let's see it. It's extraordinary, but not unique.
We know that this was driven by famine, floods. There was probably insane inflation, and a particularly harsh discrimination against Han Chinese. And all of these come together to affect the collapse of the Yuan Dynasty and ultimately the founding of the Ming Dynasty.
And the lesson of history, of course, is that one can't indefinitely control a large empire only through violence. Eventually, violence will bring it to an end. And that's what happened. And we should also throw in as well growing philosophical and religious dimensions during the Ming, Confucius and Confucius scholars. So there's an intellectual climate around about how life should be lived and how one would live one's life and so forth. And I think that filters through to give a kind of moral and intellectual shape.
Well, we just mentioned and we know that he for a time was a Buddhist monk,
right?
And I'm having trouble squaring this idea of Buddhism and sort of pacifism with the accounts of him becoming an incredibly brutal, ruthless ruler who consolidates power with kind of remarkable speed. He must have been a conflicted individual.
I suppose, the first emperor, a reputation for being aggressive, strict, quite brutal himself in order to keep control.
And his imperial name that he chooses, Hongwu, means mighty in war.
Right.
So we're letting some people know how he's going to rule, right? And he chooses the name Ming, which means bringer of light. So I think that here's this conflict within himself, perhaps, of that he needs to be perceived as mighty in war, as ruthless, as very powerful and demanding. But he wants, and he's striving for this new dynasty to be one of light, to be one of excellence, to be one of possibility, perhaps.
Absolutely. And the modern saying, which has been hinted at by many leaders in the last 70, 80 years, that in order to have peace, you have to prepare for war in a world where there are hostilities. And so being generous towards the first Ming emperor, bringing unity to China, returning the Chinese themselves, the ethnic Chinese, to control.
And I just want to jump in and say, too, we're saying the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, not the first emperor of China.
The first Ming emperor.
Right. And I think it's a great place to sort of jump in with a discussion of some specific examples, because you did mention that he does initially sort of turn to Confucian scholars to legitimize his rule, emphasizing order, hierarchy, moral governance. And there's actually some ceramics that comes out of this. Can you tell us about this a little bit?
It's ceramics that I shouldn't keep saying that I love this more than anything else, because I say it in every single episode. But it seems to me that in a powerfully aesthetic manner, we develop an approach to porcelain which has what we might call a profound simplicity to it at some level. And there is one particular jug in the collection of the Met, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is actually based on a monk's cap. It's a Ewer, and in the 15th century, so 14-something, and a gorgeous, milky, rich porcelain surface with this lovely geometry to it. So it's a monk's cap. I have to say, you'd be doing well to guess it was a monk's cap, but that's what it's believed to be. And it has this complete reliance on simplicity of form, on its function, with minor adjustments around the top surfaces to give us, just an incredibly beautiful shape.
But again, sort of helping to illustrate this connection between ways of ruling and disseminating those ideas into the hands of people who might use these objects. So we're talking about, I think, a person here of extremes, of a sort of harsh punishment, sweeping political purges, massive surveillance apparatus, but also, also wanting greatness and pushing morality and different ways of thinking.
Profound simplicity, purity at some level, a striving for perhaps those kind of abstract values which maybe find their way into a generation of porcelain which is almost aggressively simplified. That the beauty is in the minimal.
And this piece in particular, if you zoom in or you go to the Met's website and pull up some of the other images, there's actually a small medallion carving on the neck that's very, very faint that you can't really see if you're not close up. So again, these objects invite intimacy, and they invite I think query to sort of ponder what they might have been used for. Even sort of in these early days, we can remember that porcelain has come about sort of in the Tang Dynasty, but it's the Song and the Ming that really established China with refined porcelains that we know today, with really incredibly sophisticated brushwork and mark making. The use of cobalt for blue, the use of copper to create reds, lots of stylized floral elements, chrysanthemums. There's a really beautiful bowl that I think we could talk about here that is, it's a porcelain bowl, but it's decorated with all these incredible chrysanthemums. And from a technical perspective, this is all done in red, and this is done with copper.
I was going to ask you.
And copper, this red in copper is only achieved through through what we refer to as a reduction atmosphere and firing.
Right.
And copper, it's a bit finicky. It wants to actually attach itself to the flame and move around the inside of the kiln and deposit it on something else. So, this piece that we're looking at here, it doesn't really have the markers of that, which means there's incredible control and sophisticated technology with not only the application of the pattern making, the technical skill in the very thin walls of this form, but it tells us there's a sophisticated process within the knowledge of how to fire, and all of those things have to be in place, I think, in order for the rise of Ming ceramics to become so connected to even contemporary society.
Porcelain's 700 years old by the start of the Ming, so they didn't invent it. But the previous dynasty, Song, some wonderful things. And then really Ming, understand what can be done with porcelain.
Well, it's that, Ming meaning light, right? These are just, they're light, they're resonant. They're, for me, the name of the dynasty encapsulates the type of work that we're going to be talking about in the next hour.
Yeah, translucence.
Yeah. And I want to say that I don't think that these incredible ceramics could have really risen to this high height that we recognize them now for if Hongwu hadn't rebuilt the empire in such a way that he implemented sweeping reforms. He strengthened the civil service. He created household registrations for systems of tax and local control. He establishes a stronger military. He builds a massive city wall in Nanjing. He designs, or it was designed using feng shui, which are, of course, principles to ensure auspicious qi or the flow of energy to create stability. So he's thinking about not only just the government structures, but he's also thinking, I think, clearly about sort of aesthetics and ways of being. But without this government sort of infrastructure and this groundwork that's been put in place, we might not see the incredible rise of this porcelain.
It's somehow all part of the same outlook.
It might be,
in quite an abstract way. The other thing which occurs to me, there have been successive peasant revolts, and he himself comes from that at base. The thing about simple things that, if we look at the monk's cap Ewer, it clearly does pour. They wouldn't let me take it out of the case at the Met to see if I could, they're very inconsiderate, those people.
Terribly surprising.
But frequently these things, the bowl, it couldn't be more sublimely clear and simple, and clearly functions as a bowl. In other words, functional things work, and peasants work.
Yeah.
And you might have an attitude to society that we should all work. So quite often when simplicity comes to the fore, it's quite often connected to revolutions or to social change, and it's quite often connected to the idea of objects that work. They're not fancy pants things that you can't do anything with. They're not things which you just have to keep and they don't do anything. Yeah. And if we were being really crude, there might have been an attitude that some objects are sort of drones. You can't use them. So the search for a beauty which is also useful, it's going to be a great paradigm of modernism.
It will be,
centuries later. And I think it's at work here.
I think it is too, but I think it's also important for us to note that not everything having to do with ceramics was rosy. And in fact, because of some of his strict bans on imports of sort of wanting China to rise up, meant that initially in his reign, there's a period where blue and white wares from this era have a weaker tone, where the painting feels a little bit more watercolory, not as quite contrasty and vibrant, and that has to do with the interruption of cobalt imports coming from Persia. They had to mix it with local cobalt. It wasn't quite as good. They had to water it down. And there's a Ming plate that we were looking at earlier that's sort of two deer fawns kind of nibbling grass on a hillside with some plants kind of around the rim of this Ming period plate. And it just feels clunky to me. Visually, it feels a bit like a kind of childlike, a little bit less refined, certainly. It's beautiful, but to me, that work, even though it's blue and white, this piece in particular doesn't have the same kind of resonance as some of the pieces that we're going to get into with imperial dragons dancing around the surface of them.
Are we saying that we think this is not yet fully mature? I think not yet fully in control.
Not yet fully in control, but also maybe a lack of access to quality materials.
Yeah. Now, Stephanie, tell us how they got the blue in the first place and what exactly the blue is.
Well, the blue is cobalt, and the blue comes through the Silk Road from trade from Persia, it's I mean, we still do this today. You mix cobalt oxide or carbonate. There's lots of different ways and material that it comes to us in, and I can make something called a wash with cobalt, a little bit of clay, and some fluxing material, which helps it to melt and stick to the pot. Then I can paint that. I can paint that like a watercolor across the surface of a vessel. I can thin it out, and you get a lighter blue. I can thicken it, and it's a darker blue. The Ming masters were really incredible because when we look at something like this jar with dragon from the early 15th century, which has this beautiful dragon form dancing around this big jar, kind of almost a moon jar shape with a really big swollen shoulder, clouds and other dragon heads dancing around it. It almost looks like the blue is darker in some areas and lighter in others, but they were masters of using negative space to actually fool our optical intake to think that is darker blue when it's just in contrast with the white. So there's some incredible visual color theory here. And of course, we see this dragon here with 3 claws. And that's important to note because that tells me who this pot was for. In that if you were to come across a dragon with 5 claws, that is meant for the emperor. 4 claws, the imperial family, 3 claws, perhaps the merchant class. And so, again, they're not just sort of beautiful stylized imagery.
Any one-clawed ones?
They are telling stories, Paul.
Yes.
They're telling stories.
They're telling us who this dragon is about.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Now, what we're hinting at here is that despite the fact that we think of Ming and we think of China with blue and white, the actual technology wasn't theirs to begin with. It came from the Islamic Empire.
The material comes from there, certainly.
Yeah.
And before we jump,
but the idea, the blue comes from the Arabs.
It does. And before we jump ahead to that, I think we also just need to make mention that Hongwu sets up the groundwork, but it's actually his son when his son comes to power.
Yeah.
Yongle, who ruled
Yongle.
from Yongle, right, 1402 to 1424, and he was incredibly ambitious. He moves the capital from Nanjing or Beijing in 1421 and created the famous Forbidden City.
Yeah.
And he commissioned monumental sort of encyclopedia to showcase the cultural achievements. Right. So we've got someone who is deeply, I think, interested in culture and pushing the Ming Dynasty forward in that way.
Yeah.
So he has this grand ambition for the Ming Dynasty, and he has the same grand ambition for ceramics, I'd like to think. I think there's evidence in that.
I think there's lots of evidence for that. And in another way, it is another interesting watershed moment, isn't it? That the Ming is established, and then Yongle, in effect, continues the reorganization and creates a China which is one that's still very powerfully what we have today. He moves to Beijing. The Forbidden City is built, and it's still there. And Beijing is still the capital of China. So we established the political, social, the centralized nature of China.
Yeah, and I think what's really amazing to me is the capital's in Beijing, but all of this incredible ceramics is again coming from
From
Jingdezhen, right?
Jingdezhen,
In
yeah.
which, in comparison, Beijing is we're talking about the northern plains of China, and Jingdezhen is sort of tucked into a mountainous region in the southeast.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's really during Yonglu's rule that he dramatically increases the porcelain production.
Yeah.
And importantly, Yonglu reopens the trade route to Persia
Yeah.
and imports the good cobalt, right,
Yeah.
as opposed to the subpar
Ah.
Chinese. So we go from that sort of watercolory, thinner, more transparent, not as concentrated blue that we saw on that earlier plate with the two deer, and then this really intense cobalt color, and that really changes the investment in Jingdezhen, the access to high quality cobalt, and there's this technological leap.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. And it's a footnote because you quite rightly raised Beijing is the capital, but Jingdezhen is somewhere else altogether.
It is, and so there's got to be like massive infrastructure and roads to be able to transport all of this work. So just again, we've been talking about infrastructure, and I think it's all has to be deeply connected because Jingdezhen is the place that has the kaolin, the white clay material that makes porcelain. It's not anywhere else. It wouldn't make sense to dig up all that material, transport it to Beijing, and make it there on site. That just does not make sense.
Absolutely. There is an interesting equivalent because I always think when we go back so far, if we can provide a crude equivalent to give people's imaginations, if there were an equivalent in this country, it would be Stoke-on-Trent, where the ceramic industry developed and then totally dominated. But of course, Josiah Wedgwood, one of the great figures in Stoke-on-Trent, he was using London to market and sell. So Beijing, Jingdezhen, China being run from one place, the porcelain being made in another, and vital that all the communications, the roads, the Silk Road, the international connections and so forth are all there to feed Jingdezhen and then to market the material. So really a profoundly modern ceramic economy.
The artisans who have now access to these incredible materials are refining their forms. They're making a glossier, clear glaze. They're achieving a really beautiful kind of almost, I would say, sculptural depth in the two-dimensional painting of their floral designs. They're using these incredibly rich blues and whites to create this sense of dimension. There's a really beautiful bowl called Bowl with Pomegranates that I think we could take a look at. And the pomegranates are right in the center, but these sort of chrysanthemum scrolls are opening up around the inside of this bowl. And they look three-dimensional to me. They look like they're carved, but they have this incredibly beautiful sense of depth and kind of perspective that leads you down into the center of this piece.
It's a fantastic thing,
It really is.
So we have a high level of sophistication, of skill.
We do. What's really clear here is that there are influences, there are external influences at play here from the Islamic Empire, from the trade roads being reopened, the import of the porcelain, or sorry, not the porcelain, but the cobalt. And what we see are not only just pattern influences, but also forms. So there are these incredible flasks, forms that imitate oil lamps from inside mosques. There's a really, we could look at this flask with a medallion sort of painted on the center, and that is absolutely an Islamic form and an Islamic pattern in Chinese porcelain, right? So there's this clear outside influence at play, and that becomes a powerful visual language, doesn't it?
Do you think we're going to be coming back to the Islamic nations frequently in the future? One of the great things I know we both love is the pattern formations in Islam. Do you think where this was being seen in China, presumably had some kind of influence on it? Do we think?
I mean, I think absolutely. Those Islamic vessels have sort of a principle of having a big kind of pattern to grab you or a figure.
Yeah.
We might call it figure ground, where
Yeah.
there's a big figure and then there's sort of a quieter pattern and activity below, almost sort of 3 layers that move you around the space. And I think that is absolutely at play when we start to look at these pieces. Even the bowl with pomegranates, the scrolls and chrysanthemums we were just talking about. We have the pomegranates in the center, we've got the chrysanthemums, and then we have these little petals and scrolls coming around. And I think that I see direct correlations between that type of visual influence. And again, we're talking about rulers here who have multi-ethnic empires, and they were remarkably open to Islam and Islamic peoples.
Absolutely. And it's something we tend to forget. We think it's just a feature of now, of the whole, well, there's lots of discussion in our current world about immigration and the moving of peoples around, but in actual fact, it'd be very naive. It was happening then, big time. And Islam was in China, and there were followers of Islam in the military in China.
Yeah.
He employed generals and so forth. So, Islam from the 7th century onwards had been growing and developing and was an intimidating empire by the time the Ming opened. And there was a kind of a coming together of the two.
So this is a sort of an interesting thing to me to say, okay, we're trading, we're bringing these things in, and they're absolutely giving us this cross-cultural design. But I think what we have to really talk about, which is a crucial reason why we can walk into, or I can walk into any China shop in Chinatown, and I can buy myself a Ming Dynasty knockoff bowl, right? And that's because China opened trade routes during the Ming Dynasty, right?
They did.
Let's talk. I guess I want to talk a little bit about how this work gets out around the world.
Yeah. So here we are. We've Jingdezhen, the single biggest, most sophisticated ceramic manufactory and city in the world at that stage, by a long way, I would think. And a cosmopolitan culture that's in touch with cultures elsewhere. The Silk Road has been open for a long time, and there are recent publications on the Silk Road. It makes it sound as though it's just a little stream of people walking along with camels. It's a metaphor. It's a euphemism for massive amounts of trade, east-west, and to a certain extent, west-east. But certainly the trade routes were open. The Chinese Navy, the merchant navy, enormous. And the Chinese realize that there is an incredible market for porcelain. And the main reason for that is that nobody else knows how to make it.
Yeah.
And it's been said by many scholars, and I've said it, and I agree with it, and now you do. We hit a moment in the history of ceramics where, certainly in the Western world, it's a quest for white.
Yeah.
And for that gorgeous. So if we think back to the lovely jug, which is in the form of a monk's cap, that level of translucence and white, you don't need to do anything else. That's enough. You couldn't make that in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you couldn't make it in Europe for another 800 years.
Right. And I think it's important to just spend a little bit of time here talking about these kind of epic maritime voyages, because I think this is probably the place where that porcelain really gets to other locations.
Yeah.
And we know that there were about 7 massive sea voyages between like 1405, I think, and 1433 across the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, involving hundreds of ships, thousands of men. And presumably they have filled these ships with things to trade, right? And porcelain's one of them, right? So this is, one of the big exoduses of these objects that were traded. They were gifted to Muslim rulers across Southeast Asia and East Africa. They traded for spices, textiles, all of these incredible goods. Link and bringing those things back to the emperor. So it's the first time porcelain, maybe the first time, I don't know, one of the earliest times where we're seeing porcelain used as a currency,
Yeah.
right? Global diplomacy through clay.
Its nickname was white gold.
Right.
So that's a pretty good giveaway. We have records from Marco Polo, of course, who took bits of porcelain back to Italy with him in the 13th century, and people marveled. So it's a slow growth. These first ships that went around the 70s, they remain magical and wonderful and somewhat mysterious, not necessarily trading that much to begin with. I think it's the Chinese kind of thinking, who's out there? And diplomacy. They've realized that in order to become a great empire, you need trade and you need to steal everybody else's ideas. You need correspondence with people and so forth. Maybe those lessons could still be learned in our contemporary society, that migration and collaboration leads to the growth of really great civilizations. But very quickly after that, they're trading, and they've got lots of stuff. Silk.
Right.
Silk is a major. But I would say it's equal relatively quickly porcelain.
Yeah.
As opposed to other forms of ceramic. Porcelain is the thing they know how to make, and nobody else knows how to do that. The Islamic Empire doesn't have it.
Right.
Europeans, no idea.
Yeah.
Nobody else knows how to do it.
Yeah.
So, in effect, it really is worth its weight in gold.
Right.
But probably more so.
Right. So this sounds like an incredible era of global connectivity, but we know that it doesn't last forever. The Ming Dynasty eventually stopped their maritime voyages, and it's kind of shockingly short-lived.
They do, and we've hinted at it through several of our Chinese episodes, and in this one as well, that whilst we have a united China, there's constantly internal strife in order to hold on to the empire. And Ming has problems internally and the struggles internally in civil war. Principally, once again, the rise of the Mongols means that attention turns away, for this period of time at least, from this open internationalism to sorting out problems at home. So these voyages of adventure at this moment ceased entirely during the reign of Xuandu, 1425, 1435. So once again, China, as it were, backs off.
Right. And it's because these things are enormously expensive, presumably. People in the court are starting to question whether or not this is, there's benefits from it. But you're right. They totally kind of pull inward. And in 1449, Zheng Tong, the next emperor, who was actually captured by the Mongol forces during the Tumu crisis, it just ceases to exist. This sort of real internal space. So, shall we talk about this fall of the Ming? There was a pretty epic battle that was a catastrophic military defeat.
Bringing Ming once again to closure. It was widely described in the literature as raiding nomads from the north, but essentially the Mongols, who highly sophisticated fighting units who overran Ming, captured the emperor, and in real terms brings the age to an end.
And it's shocking and it's humiliating. This massive sort of artistically, culturally outward-looking empire falls in such a tragic kind of way due to kind of exposed vulnerabilities, maybe, and the whole dynasty in China as a whole, they pivot inward, right? And instead of looking outward and with trade and expanding knowledge and welcoming knowledge in, they expand the Great Wall of China. They start to fortify. It's
an attempt to address this major problem of constant. They're not a nation; they're a continent in effect, in scale, keeping control of that and ordering it.
The Chinese are also, their finances are strained at this point because they're trying to fight off what I would imagine are multiple runs at their massive continent, as you say.
Yeah.
Do you think that this shift inward it has an effect on the culture at home? Do you think?
I think undoubtedly it does.
Yeah, and I sort of see this, it's a very sort of liberal ideology of the Ming initially, and then this turn inward, which is quite conservative.
Yeah.
There's accounts that there was a rise in Neo-Confucian ideas that encouraged a conservative outlook and looking at any kind of foreigners as barbarians. Foreign trade becomes literally suspect. It's probably dangerous to trade, to be seen as trading. And the power of eunuchs grew, corruption grew in the government. So it's all of these markers that sort of lead to the demise of a great power, right? Yeah. And finally, again, another peasant uprising in the 1630s. The dynasty that comes after, the Qing, 1644, Ming Dynasty is done by this time. And what do we know about the reputation of ceramics?
The reputation, I would say, of China, of the mass of China in the outside world it begins to pick up this idea of an enormous, perhaps ungovernable mass that nevertheless produced things of immense high quality. There's no doubt about that chinoiserie, the Ming, that notion of things which are superb, silk art, the papers, but especially porcelain, are beginning to filter around the world, and they are seen as the very greatest. But at the same time, there's a recognition that this landmass is confusing and doesn't seem to necessarily be in control of itself. So it begins to pick up a reputation which is largely unfair, of a kind of decadence almost. And that seems to be an image that surrounds Chinese culture for several centuries.
I'd like to take it kind of maybe away from that much larger Chinese history sort of narrative and bring it back to the place in which porcelain is coming out of, and that's Jingdezhen.
Yeah.
And I think what's important to sort of bring to the front here as we come to a close is that Jingdezhen didn't just produce beautiful objects. The production of these ceramics really acted as a physical record of culture and history that illustrates this story of a penniless peasant, where we started our episode today, striving for stability, to a golden age of state-run kilns, global treasure fleets that went out around the world, to this finally conservative inward turn. We can really see China's shifting relationship with the outside world right there in the glaze of these porcelain objects.
What we're saying is that the story of Ming and Ming ceramics is actually the story of China itself.
It is. So I think that's it from us this week. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye. If you like what you heard today, please leave us a comment and give us a follow wherever you get your podcasts. Or go to HENI.com/The History of Ceramics. Goodbye.